tonight is going to be a very interesting share. It's going to be a very interesting share because we're going to really go through some of the very critical aspects of history. I'm going to try and answer among the most difficult questions that have ever been posed. And I'm really trying to do that. We're going to a very great in-depth study, some very dark and mysterious subjects. First of all, let me just review some basic concepts before I go on. We have said basically the following. We have said that there is a certain concept that was established, the Bereshit established a certain basic concept in order to redeem the Jews, save the Jews from a possible destruction due to their own transgressions, their own sins. And what we said was that if you have a Jew on your soil who commits a sin,
would you write a name?
We have said that if a Jew does a sin, what happens is a certain amount of kedusha or holiness which is invested in that person is usurped by the Sultan. A Jew needs kedusha. The kedusha he gets when he does mitzvah. We have said that the kedusha, he takes the kedusha essentially and it absorbs into the neshama, and with that he has the ability to transform all physical reality and create an olam haba. This is the essential meaning of what it means to be a Jew. When a Jew does a sin, what happens basically, when the nations of Jews do sins, what happens is that kedusha is absorbed by the Satan or by certain dark evil forces. Forces of tumah, which absorbs it. And what happens is that tumah then is transferred to certain Gentile nations. The Gentile nations can absorb that kedusha because they have a unique relationship with the Satan by virtue of their own sins and their own deep transgressions. They have defiled themselves and they have destroyed in many cases a great amount of their own kedusha, and by doing that they have connected themselves in a very, very powerful way to the forces of tumah or the forces of the Satan. You see, when the Jews then begin to defile themselves through transgression, that kedusha then goes into the hands of the Satan through the process of accusation or kitrut, and then what the Bereshit has said is that kedusha then will translate itself or filter into the hands of the Gentile nations, so that the kedusha of the Jews is then transferred via the Satan to the Gentile nations. We discussed at length what that means, what that transfer means. It means essentially that the Goyish nations or the Gentile nations become inflated in their powers of chokhmah, in their science, in their technology, in their wisdom, in their philosophy, and in their capacity to prosper in their financial aspects, in their technology, and so on and so forth. But that is a direct result of the kedusha that should be in the hands of the Jews going over to the Goyim. This process, which is a triangulation process, is a very important one. It's a way that the Gentiles acquire the kedusha of a Jew. Now, what is the purpose of that? The purpose of that is that if they do acquire it, they become a vessel which holds the kedusha of the Jews. And while they're holding it, they're benefiting from it. But what happens then, the purpose of this transference is so that the Jews will then descend into these Gentile nations. And the kedusha that the Gentile nations now have from the Jews gives them the ability to hold the Jews in captivity. It gives them power over the Jews itself. That's how a Gentile interacts with a Jew. Gentiles or Goyim that have the kedusha of the Jews in them, in their interior, have the ability to interface with Jews and have power over them. So what happens is the power that the Gentiles have over the Jews is designed to attempt to seduce the Jews away even further from Torah. And what happens is the Jews must sustain their belief in that Gentile nation. That Gentile nation will use the kedusha of the Jews, you see, in the form of their own Gentile thought, in their own darkness. And with that kedusha of the Jews themselves, the attempt will be made to seduce the Jews away from their religion. Now, if the Jews sustain themselves, if they maintain their Yerushalayim, if they maintain their religiosity, if they observe the Torah and so on, what will happen is that the kedusha of the Goyim, their kedusha which is in the hands of the Goyim, will come back to them. You see, and as it comes back, they will be released from that Gentile nation. That's the concept of exile and redemption. When the Jews sinned, their strength or kedusha, holiness, goes to a Gentile nation. Then they are exiled into that Gentile nation, into the bosom of that Gentile nation. And that Gentile nation has the ability, with the power of the Jews themselves, to seduce the Jews away from the Torah. If the Jews sustain that, if they refuse to do it, then what happens is that the Jews draw back or retrieve that kedusha, and they are then worthy of redemption. That's the basic formula. So the essence of this process, where the Goyim have the kedusha of the Jews, the power of the Jews, is to provide themselves as a vessel, to create the opportunity where the Jews can retrieve it. Because if the kedusha did not descend into a Gentile nation as such, then the Jews would not be able to retrieve it really. Now, if the Jews are seduced by the Goyim, if the Jews fall and they continue to further transgress, then that power of the Goyim becomes much more intense and severe. And what happens is the Goyim begin to persecute the Jews, literally. So in other words, the power that the Goyim have from the Jews is first used to seduce the Jews away from the Torah. And if they succeed, then they lose further power to the Goyim. Further much of their kedusha, more of their kedusha goes to the Goyim. And with this additional power, what happens is that the Goyim then have the ability to literally persecute them at first. This is what's very critical. You see, very, very critical. You find a classic example of the Jews in Egypt. When the Jews first descended into Egypt, the first thing, when that happened at the first time, was that the Jews in Egypt weren't put into slavery right away. It didn't occur right away. It occurred only after many years. The last 80 years of the exile in Egypt was actual work or slavery, you see. For the first 130 years, the Jews were simply in the land of Egypt as a seduction. The classic example is Egypt. For the first 130 years, the Jews were in Egypt. They were simply living in Egypt, and some of their rights were curtailed, but they didn't know slavery at all. And Egypt served as a seduction to them. But when they fell and they began to worship idols like the Egyptians, then what happened is the Egyptians then accessed more of the power of the Jews and literally became their slave masters. So this is the progression. It is a two-step process. The triangulation occurs in two steps. You see, first is seduction. The Gentiles first use the kedusha of the Jews to seduce them. And if they succeed, then they have the ability to persecute them. But in either case, if the Jews withstand seduction, or if they suffer the persecution, in either case, what happens is that the kedusha of the Goyim then goes back to the Jews. That is the triangulation process. Now, the question that we asked last time is that who can qualify as such a Goyish nation? There are many Goyim. Who can qualify as that? Which Gentile nation can serve as a vessel for the kedusha of Jews? And what we said was that none of them really. Why? Because by the origin of the Goyim, and we won't go that now, we had many shum on that, the Goyim, their neshamas, or the souls of Goyim, are very, very low or small with respect to kedusha because of the sins that they have done, their ancestors have done, and which they have done. They have essentially forced God to confiscate an enormous amount of kedusha from their neshamas. So therefore, their nefesh has very little to do with kedusha. It only has to do with the kedusha of their own minimal deeds, which is the 7 mitzvahs. Because of that, when the Jews lose their kedusha, that kedusha cannot go into the hands of the Goyim, because the neshamas of the Goyim are too small to hold it. Such enormous kedusha. So what we said was that the only one who could become the vessel for this retrieval process is someone who already has incredible kedusha. But who besides the Goyim or the Jews have such incredible kedusha? If the Goyim don't have it, you see, and the Jews are the ones who are losing it, then who's picking it up? So the answer that we said was the children of Abraham, and specifically Yishmael and Esau. Abraham had 2 sons, Yishmael and Yitzchak. And Yitzchak had 2 sons, Esau and Yaakov. And in both cases, Yishmael and Esau were originally given an enormous neshamas, and they had specific holy tasks to do. But they abused their tasks. And because they abused their tasks, you see, they established a certain amount of tumah, or defilement, or damage to their souls. So therefore, both Yishmael and Esav, you see, became of the status where they had both Kedusha and tumah together in their neshamas, you see. Therefore, Yishmael and Esav and their descendants become the perfect vessels to hold the Kedusha of a Jew. Because it has a certain amount of tumah and it has a certain amount of Kedusha. And the combination of these two things yields for the first time a real vessel to hold the Kedusha of the Jew. That's the Goyish nation. Only the descendants of Esav and the descendants of Yishmael. Who are the descendants of Yishmael and Esav? We have said the descendants of Yishmael are the Arabs, and the descendants of Esav, essentially, that we have today, is all of Christendom. Essentially. All descendants from the Roman Empire and the Roman influence, essentially, are considered the children of Esav. In fact, Catholicism is called the Holy Roman Empire. That's really what it's called, the Roman Catholic Church. And this is the essence of it. Now we'll get into that more specifically, but that's essentially the thing. Therefore, in order to be a Goy, a Gentile nation which has the capacity to absorb the Kedusha of the Jews and become such a vessel, that Gentile nation has to have had the certain Kedusha on themselves, and that's the Kedusha that they had, because once they had forefathers who had the Kedusha of Jews, Abraham and Isaac, Avram Yitzchak, they had some enormous Kedusha in themselves, they were the patriarchs. So therefore, that person would have had to have descended from Abraham and Isaac. Must have descended. That's number one. Number two, that person must have acquired some tumah or some defilement on his own, and which means that person must have become a rasha or an evil person. Such a person is exactly the individual who can fit that description. That is the profile of the goy who can become the retrieval vessel or the repository of the Oros or the Kedusha of the Jew. We further said that the essence of what we're talking about is really a process of consumption, or in Hebrew which is called achila. Consumption. What we said was that, again, how do the Jews get back their Kedusha when they lose? They get it back if they resist the seduction of the Goyim, or if they suffer at the persecution of this Gentile nation, either Yishmael or Esav. You see, how does that work? Well, when they suffer from them, then literally this Gentile nation, with the power of Esav or Yishmael, consumes the Jews. It's a process of eating. It's a figurative eating. When Jews suffer pogroms and all kinds of terrible persecutions that they have with Goyim, in a certain sense, in fact, the Goyim are eating the Jews. They're consuming them. That's a process of consumption. That process of consumption and the pain and suffering that comes from it forces the life or the Kedusha to come, or the power to come back to the Jews. You see. Now, as we have said, this is a very strange process. Because normally when you eat something, then what happens is the nutrients which exist in the object which is eaten becomes part of the one who has eaten it. You see. The lion who preys on the zebra eats the zebra and absorbs the flesh, the protoplasm of the zebra. You see. And what happens is the zebra becomes part of the flesh of the lion. So the consumer, the one who consumes, you see, absorbs the nutrients or the substance of the one that is consumed. That's normally how it's done. But here we see the reverse. The Goyim consume the Jews. They persecute them. They rob them of everything. And as they do it, they begin to die. Because the power begins to go away from them back to the object of consumption. The exact opposite. Do we see that? And that's the rule of consumption, or the rule of the Hashgacha, the divine providence, as it relates to the Jews. In all the Gentile nations, when one Gentile nation fights with another, and there's a war, and one conquers the other, then the Kedusha, or the power which exists in one Gentile nation, the one that's lost, becomes absorbed or attached to the Gentile nation who is won, the victor. The victor absorbs the power of the loser, you see. That's the rule in all divine providence when it comes to Gentile nations. But when it comes to the Jews, it's the reverse. When the Goyim conquer the Jews and they cause them suffer and they persecute them, then what happens is the Kedusha leaves that goy and goes back to the Jew who is the victim. And then after that, the Jews are redeemed from that Gentile nation, and that Gentile nation then dies. It descends, it loses its power, and it just fades out of the history. That's why the Jews survive, and no Goyish nation survive. You see, the question of Jewish survival, which is always being asked, why do the Jews exist today? The question that the Goyim ask, the question that the Jews ask, why is it the Jews survive? We've been persecuted by almost every nation in history, you see. So why is it that all these other nations are no longer here? The Romans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians, all these people are no longer here, and we're still here. Why? When we've been under their foot. The answer is because of the mystery of this reverse process, you see. When a Goy persecutes a Goy, the victim dies. That's why all these nations were conquered by other Goyim, and they disappeared, they faded out. You see, their light or their power, that their nefashos were shredded and just distributed to the other nations. But with the Jew, it's the reverse process. So whoever attacks the Jew and conquers the Jew and persecutes him must die, and the Jew again lives. So it's a resurrection. Every time a Jew is conquered by a Gentile nation, he's resurrected, and the Gentile nation expires. An incredible reversal of divine providence. It is that principle which allows the Jews to survive throughout all exile, through the thousands of years of exile and persecution at the hands of the Goyim. Now we're in a position to go on and to examine the entire process much more minutely. Much more minutely. What happens? We have said the fundamental formula is that the Jews sin, and on the basis of their sin, that sin absorbs the Kedusha, and therefore it is transferred to a vessel nation. In this case, the descendants of Esav and Yishmael, and then is allowed to be retrieved by the Jews. But wait a minute. Is that the whole formula? Is that the whole thing? History is so much more complex than this little simple formula, you see. What happens if the Jews do a certain sin? Or what happens if the Jews do another type of sin? Or sometimes the Jews can do sins which are qualitatively different. For example, Jews can do one type of sin. Jews can be involved in not keeping Shabbos. Or they can do other types of sins. For example, they can be involved, in theft, in robbing from each other, or just stealing, whatever stories, or bad business ethics. You see, so there are different types of sins. There are many different mitzvahs that the punishment commanded us. It's possible to transgress many different types. That's number one. There's also the quantity, the intensity. You can do a sin on a certain level, you can do a sin on a much worse level. So obviously, the loss of Kedusha, or the loss of the power of the Jews, you see, in terms of the quality of the mitzvah, the type of the mitzvah, and the aberration of the mitzvah, the type of the sin, there's a quantity and there's a quality of a sin. Quality of a sin means the different type of mitzvah that you're transgressing. The quantity of a sin is how bad you've been, you see. Are you doing this intentionally? I mean, there are many levels in which a person can sin, you see. A person can sin because he has to, he feels there's no other way, but he really doesn't want to, or he can sin because he's happy about it, and he wants to rebel against God. There are many levels, or many states of mind when a person sins, you see. So therefore, when we see therefore that there are quantity and quality to different sins, you see, does that in some way affect this picture? In other words, let's look at this. Let's say, for example, there are different levels of sin. Let's say, talk about quantity first. Let's say there's quantity, there's a level called A, there's a level called B, and there's a level called C. A being the lightest, and C being the worst. If you transgress and you do sin A, you have done a bad thing. If you do sin B, you've done even worse. If you do sin C, it's even worse. There are different gradations on how bad or how much you've transgressed. Okay, that means that the amount of Kedusha that you'll lose will also vary, you see. So the question that we're asking, how does this affect the triangulation process? Does this affect the type of Goyish nation which will then become the source or resource of your exile? And the answer is yes. You see. And this is very important, extremely, extremely deep concept. In fact, it is so deep that it's one of the cornerstones of all human history, really. Very difficult to figure this out. The formula we can understand, but the details of this is very difficult to understand. What am I talking about? When you look at all the nations out there, you see, as I said, the Jews will not interact with any Goyish nation. They won't. Why? Because the Goyish nations cannot be Gentile nations on the normal conditions, cannot interface with the Jews, because they have nothing to do with the Jews. You have to understand that the Jews come in contact with any Gentile nation only for a certain purpose. The Jews don't belong in the exile. The Jews don't belong among the Gentile nations. The Jews belong in the land of Israel. They belong in their own country with their own Torah and their own government and their own Kedusha. They don't belong dispersed among the nations of the world. The reason why they're dispersed among the nations of the world is because their Kedusha is dispersed. And they have to go retrieve it, so therefore they are dispersed physically among the world, you see. But which nations are they dispersed? Do they go to all the nations of the world? Obviously not. If you will trace Jewish history, you will see that the Jews have been involved essentially only with the European nations and the Muslim nations. And that for all practical purposes, Jews have never interfaced with the Asiatics or the Orientals, except on an extremely minuscule level. But Jews have had nothing to do with Africa, Australia, and most of Asia, or China, the Orient or Asia, you see. Nothing at all. Which shows us that the Goyim which exist in that part of the nation are pure Goyim. They are true and blue Gentiles, meaning that they have nothing to do with Esav and Yishmael. They cannot serve as vessels, and since they cannot serve as vessels, the Jews have no business going to them. If the Jews are going to certain Goyish nations, it's because the Jews must interface with those Gentiles who can serve as a vessel. Now, the Gentile nations who can serve as a vessel are the descendants of Esav and Yishmael. Therefore, the Jews will interface in the diaspora, in all of exile, only with those kinds of nations. You see, that's a very, very important clue. But wait, there are many different nations in Europe, and many nations in, in the Muslims. Why is it that the Jews sometimes are in exile in England? Why is it that the Jews were thrown out of England, then they're thrown out of Spain, they're thrown out of France with the different expulsions, and so on? Why is it that sometimes Jews go to Holland or sometimes to Italy? What causes that? Because that is determined by the quantity and quality of the sin, which shows us a very, very important thing. Esav is not monolithic. Esav is simply not Esav, with a certain type of Kedusha and a certain type of Tumah that will serve as a vessel. Esav is a spectrum of many levels, you see. So that Esav will be on different levels. Esav, let's say, will be on 1, 2, 3. The same thing with Yishmael on 1, 2, 3. You see. 1 is the simplest level, 3 is the deepest level. You see, so that Esav himself is fragmented. What causes Esav to be fragmented? He himself. For example, the children of Esav, or those who have been influenced by Esav, doesn't mean that they're all subject to the same type of providence. One nation in Esav could be worse than the other, you see. So if one nation has become more evil than the other, then what happens is he becomes more and more debased in terms of his tumah that he possesses. So that Esav himself will descend according to different levels. And the same thing with the Arabs or Yishmael. You see, the Syrian Muslims or the Syrian Arabs may be very different than the Saudi Arabian Arabs or the Iranian Arabs. You see, very different what? In the sense of what their inner souls are collectively of the nation. The souls of the Arabs in Saudi Arabia can be very different than the souls of the Arabs of Iraq. You see, even though it's all Yishmael, and therefore every neshama basically who exists in every nefesh, every soul which exists in an Arab may be basically the same. They may have the general Kedusha of Yishmael and the general Tumah of Yishmael, but they themselves could have added to that Tumah. They could have done more sins, they could have been more evil. So that they themselves will begin to become heterogeneous or distribute themselves according to different levels. Do we see what I'm saying? Therefore, that's a very important thing. Esav and Yishmael are therefore not monolithic, but rather they are varied in their own Kedusha Tumah levels. Now what difference does that make for the Jews? The answer is because then the variation in the Jews' sins, in terms of the quality and quantity of their sins, now could be fit or measured according to the variations of Esav and Yishmael. You see that? So therefore, the Kedusha and the Tumah of the Jews will then in some way become equal to the Kedusha and Tumah of the Goyim. In other words, the Jews, when they perform a certain type of sin, when the Jewish nation as a whole practices or transgresses in a certain type of sin, qualitatively, and a certain intensity of that sin, they will suddenly find themselves in one of the descendants of Esav Yishmael, who is a reflection in some way of that sin. And that nation, or that variant of Esav or Yishmael, will become the vessel to hold the Kedusha, and it will become the vessel which the Jews will be exiled to. Do we see that? Very important. That's why sometimes the Jews are suddenly exiled to Poland, or sometimes they're exiled to Russia, you see. Or sometimes they'll be exiled to Spain. Why? What is the difference? The difference is that in some way, the persecutor nation, the Gentile nation, that now holds Jews, the container nation, the Gentile nation which contains the Jews, you see, is in some way a reflection of the Jews themselves, the tumah or the transgression that they've done. Very, very important principle. Now, can we figure out which Gentile nations, which descendants of Esav or Yishmael will be the ones that will hold the Jews based on certain circumstances? Very difficult assignment. Because in order to know that, you've got to know, you see, what the effects, what the consequences are of all the different types of transgressions that a Jew is capable of doing. Then you've got to know the base souls, the basic soul of all the different descendants of Esav and Yishmael, and you've got to be able to match the two. You see, are these principles knowable? Yes, but it is an extraordinarily difficult task. You see, extraordinarily difficult, because in order to do that, of course, you've got to find or understand what's in the place or the interior of all the Gentile nations. But I tell you that if you were able to do it, if you could figure out what I've just said, you would understand most of human history. You would be able to explain it and understand why Yah did what he did. The logic, the pattern of it. These are the principles. So, summarizing basically, we see that there are two types of goyim, or Gentile nations. There are those goyim, you see, who are regular goyim, you see, and there are those goyim who can serve as a vessel for the Jews. The goyim or regular goyim will not interface with the Jews, because they cannot become a vessel for the kedusha of the Jews if the Jews sin. So the Jews will not interface with the normal goyim. Which goyim are that? These are the goyim of Africa, the goyim of Australia, the goyim of Asia, and of the Orient. These are normal goyim, and their job in this world is for themselves. God deals with them directly because of their own intrinsic purpose. You see. But the other goyim, who are the descendants of Esav and Yishmael, will interface with the Jews. And they will be used by the Hanukkah HaYichud, which is the attribute of God's mercy, you see, where God saves the Jews, and they will interface with these nations. Now, which ones will they interface? That depends on their, you see, level. So that the vessel nations, if I may call that, have many levels to them, you see. And depending on the kind of what? On the kind of transgression, quantitatively and qualitatively, that the Jews do, that's the type of vessel nation they will enter. That is the essential explanation of the exile. The point here is also that a vessel nation, we have talked about a regular non-vessel nation. A non-vessel nation really has nothing to do with the Jews. It is a nation who are goyim, who simply have to do with their own purpose. They have to keep the 7 mitzvahs of Noah, and if they keep the 7 mitzvahs of Noah, right, then they will earn whatever prosperity and reward they will earn. Therefore, their objective is to deal with their own trials and their own task. The vessel nations will essentially interface with the Jews to serve the Hanukkah HaYichud, to serve the attribute of God's mercy to redeem the Jews. God will use the vessel nations as his instrument to save the Jews. You see. As such, they are the instruments of the Hanukkah HaYichud, or the attribute which attempts to redeem the world or save the world. Now, the question is that the only function of the vessel nations? No. The vessel nations, since they are also basically goyim as well, and they're not Jews, they also retain their own intrinsic function of keeping the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach. You see. They do. And since they have this as their own intrinsic function, this will determine to a large extent of their own prosperity. But the matter becomes very complicated, because a vessel nation now has two different purposes, an intrinsic purpose and an extrinsic purpose. intrinsically that vessel nation has to do with its own hatzlacha, its own mazel, its own prosperity, depending on its own deeds. But it also now relates to the Jews as a vessel nation. Now, but the two intermix, because the worse that nation is intrinsically, the more capable they're being used extrinsically. In other words, that's the point. All the Goyish nations that are vessel nations are nations that have their own job to do. They have to keep the mitzvahs themselves, the 7 mitzvahs in Noach themselves. But to the degree that they are good or to the degree that they're evil, that will determine to what extent how they will be used on the ladder as a vessel. So that a Goyish nation, which is essentially good, you see, will be used as a vessel only with respect to very light sins that the Jews do. But a Goyish nation that intrinsically transgresses the sins of Melech in an intense level, that's very evil. A Goyish nation, a descendant of Esav, who is very evil, you see, will therefore become a vessel to the Jews on a much lower level. Which means they'll become a vessel to the Jews. They'll serve as the vessel to take over the Kedusha and return the Kedusha to the Jews. You see, when the Jews do a much worse type of sin. So that's the point, you see. That the intrinsic nature of the Goyim, the intrinsic nature of the Goyim, of the vessel nations, will affect how they're being used as a vessel, what level of vessel they'll be used, when they will be used as a vessel for the Jews. The more evil the Goyish nation, the more evil that vessel nation is, then what happens is they will be used as a vessel for deeper, worse and worse transgressions of Israel, of the Jews. That's a critical formula, you see. Critical formula. Let's go on. Please. On the basis of this, let's look into the promise that God made to Avraham, to Abraham. What did the Baruch say to Avraham? God said to Avraham that I guarantee you that the Jews will never become Goyim. In other words, I guarantee you that the Jews will never lose their Kedusha. They will never become non-Jews. That was the essential promise that God made to Abraham at the Bris Bein Hamson, at the certain covenant that he drew with Abraham. Okay? He made that particular guarantee. Now, he also said that ultimately the redemption will come to the Jews whether they deserve it or not. We know that the Messiah will appear either through the merit of the Jews, in order that the Jews keep the Torah and they observe the Torah in all its ways. The Jews will bring the Messiah, the Mashiach, and the Messianic period, which is a period of tremendous Kedusha, through their efforts. But let's say the Jews fail to do that. If they fail to bring the Mashiach that way, the Mashiach will come anyway, but will come through this triangulation process, you see, where the Jews will have to retrieve their Kedusha through more severe means. You see, either Jews acquire the Kedusha through their mitzvahs, or they retrieve their Kedusha through their testing or through their suffering. So this is essentially what it is. The Jews are in the position, the souls of all Jews are in the position of either acquiring Kedusha through mitzvahs or retrieving Kedusha through some kind of persecution or very severe test situation. Those are the two options. But God guaranteed to Abraham that the Kedusha must return to the Jews. Which brings us to a very theoretical question. Well, theoretically, if the Jews, you see, get worse and worse and worse, right? To such an extent, with the Jews throughout one generation to another, are not capable of bringing the Mashiach or the Messianic time. That means, technically, that the Jews can go to such a level, you see, of tumult, such a level of transgression, where there is no vessel nation that can ever restore it. You see. Which means that the promise of God is based on a very interesting principle. That at no time in history must there ever be, or at no time in history can the Jews reach a level greater than the ability of any one Goyish nation, vessel nation, to restore their Kedusha. Do we see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is the interesting concept. In other words, if the Jews reach a level of tumult, the Jews transgress quantitatively and qualitatively in an intense degree, to such an intense degree, where there is no Gentile nation, no vessel nation, which is low enough, you see, to absorb that Kedusha, and give it back, then the Jews are lost. Do we understand this principle? It's based on what we just said. What we have said is that depending on the quantity and quality of transgression of the Jews, that will determine the kind of Gentile nation which will eventually contain them. The worse the Jews are, then in order for them to retrieve their Kedusha, there's got to be the worst vessel nation. The vessel nation must in some way reflect that. Let's look at that concept again. Okay? When the Jews sin, their Kedusha is then transferred to a vessel nation. When they sin. But the question is, doesn't it depend on the power, the intensity of that sin? Yes. If the sin that they do is very great, then the amount of tumah they will acquire will be very great. The vessel nation, which then becomes a repository for that Kedusha, must equal, in a certain sense, the tumah that the Jews are generating. That nation has to be on the level of defilement, minimally, you see, in which the Jews are also at. There's an equality here. That's the principle of the vessel nation. The vessel nation must reflect or equal in some way, some level of the tumah which the Jews are generating. That is the only type of nation which can become a vessel nation. If the Jews do things which are essentially light, then the vessel nation, which is capable of giving back the Kedusha, is one where the tumah of that nation is light. But if the tumah of the Jews, the sins of the Jews are severe, then the vessel nation must also be a very severe or damaged nation to serve as a vessel. But that tells us essentially a basic principle in history. That when God guaranteed to the Jews that they will always be saved, when God guaranteed, you see, that the Kedusha will always come back to the Jews, it means that God must always supply a nation which will never be any what? Better than the Jews. There's always got to be some vessel nation out there which serves as a potential, you see, to hold the Kedusha of the Jews, no matter how bad the Jews become. Now wait. It is possible, how far can the Jews descend? Very far. How far can the Jews descend in transgression? Very, very far. The Jews can go down to the bottom of the barrel when it comes to transgression. That means that there's got to be a nation which is also at the bottom of the barrel in the what? In the Goyish nations. There's got to be some Gentile nation which can serve as the vessel, no matter how low the Jews think. That means there's got to be a very low Gentile nation to be there. That's the Jews' insurance policy. That's the safety mechanism. If the Jews would ever sin to such a degree where none of the Goyim can serve as a vessel, the Jews would disappear. They would be annihilated as a nation because there's no way to retrieve the Kedusha, you see. So we've got to look at a candidate. We've got to look at the candidate for the Jews that will serve as the rock bottom nation, that will be there for the Jews as a safety device no matter how bad the Jews become. We need the insurance policy. And the interesting question is, which nation will serve as the insurance policy? At the outset, who was the first nation that really persecuted the Jews as Jews? Egypt, Mitzrayim. Why? We've said this many times, but essentially, when the Jews left Egypt, when they were redeemed from Egypt, from the exile of Egypt, they were supposed to enter into a state of the Messianic time. The first redemption was supposed to be the last redemption. God had no intention to continue human history after the redemption from Egypt, the way we know it. When He redeemed the Jews at that time, it was His intention to bring the Messianic period. You see. Who was the nation who would serve as a vessel nation? Who was the nation that held all of the Kedusha from the Jews that was accumulated up to that time, and to then be the nation who can restore the Kedusha to the Jews? Egypt. Egypt was that nation. When the Jews were in Egypt, and they were there for 210 years, they first were in Egypt, and they were seduced by the powers of Egypt. They fell. And eventually, because they fell, Egypt went into the second phase of what? Of retrieval, and began to persecute them. Until finally, the end of the persecution was in sight, you see. And they were redeemed. It came the time for the redemption. they left on Nisan, which is very short, which is now, tonight is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and they were redeemed on the 14th day of Nisan, Pesach. You see. The Jews went out, they went to Sinai, they were to receive the Torah. They received the Torah. At that point, they were ready for the Messianic redemption. Shortly thereafter, they worshipped the golden calf. I will not go into the depths of the golden calf, we will do that shortly. But because they worshipped the golden calf, they damaged themselves, and they made it impossible to be redeemed, or to bring the Messianic time. The sin of the golden calf is equal in power to the sin of the first man, Adam. Just like we said, when Adam was there and he had the first test, Adam Rishon could have brought the redemption. Adam Rishon could have brought the Messianic period. He failed to bring it. And because of that, he had to go on. What should have been done with him was now done to his children. Well, the second chance came out, and that second chance was the Jews in Egypt. That was the second time the Jews had the chance to again bring the Messianic period and begin to usher in the future world. The golden calf was a critical sin or critical transgression which destroyed that possibility. There's a very famous statement, you see, where Moses says at the Yam Suf, if you remember, the Jews left Egypt and they came to Yam Suf, to the Red Sea, and suddenly they turned around and they saw the Egyptians following them, and they were all frightened. And Moshe said, "Hisaptu, just sit, who was the Shuz Hashem?" And he said, what do you call it? See what the Hashem will do. And he said, very important thing, as you see the Egyptians now, you will never see them again. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Jews. He said, don't worry about it. You see the Egyptian hordes with all their chariots, you think they're about to destroy you? Don't worry about it. Because as you see them now, this is the last time you will ever see them. You will never see them again. And the Red Sea split, the Jews went through it, the Egyptians went through it, and the Red Sea came on top of their heads and destroyed them. So Moshe was correct. It was the last time they ever saw the Egyptians. But that was only the external form. When Moshe said, don't worry, as you see them now, you will never see them again, this was the one interpretation. But there's a deeper meaning to that sentence. What Moshe was saying the following, you will never see the Egyptians again. Not because they're going to die now. What he was saying is that if we together fail to bring the Messianic times, you will never see the Egyptians as the vessel nation which will be there for you in the future times. Why? Because what will happen is that if you fail to do it now, you will again add a transgression and you will have to go into a deeper nation, into another nation to retrieve your Kedusha. You see, don't think that you're going to go back to Egypt to repeat the story. You won't. Because Egypt will have served its purpose. And if you transgress again, you will have to go into another nation. You see, this is really a deeper meaning of what Moshe said. The question that we have to ask is, what is that nation? Who took the place of Egypt, really? Who is the insurance policy, you see, that the Jews will survive no matter what level they descend to? There's a very strange mitzvah in the Torah. In fact, in an external way, the mitzvah is bizarre. It really is. It is so atypical of the Jewish religion that it's really bizarre. What mitzvah am I talking about? There's a certain mitzvah in the Torah which says, we know that the Jewish religion is an extremely compassionate religion. It is based on chesed. It is based on deeds of compassion and loving kindness and tzedakah. Right? That's the essence of the Jewish nation. Yet there is one very strange mitzvah, and that mitzvah has to do with Amalek. Who is Amalek? Amalek are the descendants of Esau. Amalek himself was the grandson of Esau. He was the grandson of Esau. And there's a very peculiar mitzvah about the nation of Amalek. It is a mitzvah on every Jew, male Jew, you see, to identify an Amalek and kill him on sight. Man, woman, or child. Strange mitzvah, isn't it? Bizarre mitzvah. I mean, what is this? It is a mitzvah, essay, it is a positive commandment in the Torah to identify and instantly destroy an Amalekite, man, woman, and child, and not exert any mercy, even on the children. That includes their cattle, you see. Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, was punished severely because he went to war with the Amalekites and he allowed the king to live. Because Shaul had mercy on the king, he lost his kingdom, among other things. So Shaul was punished because he had mercy on Amalekites. But wait a minute, the essence of Judaism is mercy. How can God tell us to go wipe out an entire nation? What kind of mitzvah is this? And God says, I will give you all of my blood for this mitzvah. This is one of the 613 mitzvahs. In order to understand, we have to understand what is Amalek. And this is a very, very deep thing. To understand this is to really look into the interior of divine providence. Who is Amalek? Let's look at the history. The Jews had just come out of Egypt. You see, what happened? The Jews were in Egypt for 210 years. They finally came out and the Egyptians were wiped out. Not in a regular way, but they were destroyed in a spectacular fashion. The Jews did not war against the Egyptians. It wasn't a war, it wasn't a skirmish, it wasn't a battle. The Jews simply sat still, passive. And God said, I'll fight this one. This is my one, this is mine. And the Bonisham therefore went ahead and banged on the head 10 different plagues. The Bonisham turned upside down the heaven and the earth and did all kinds of things that have never been seen or done before. You see, things that no one else can do, that even the Egyptians said, this is the finger of God, that they realized that this ability to overturn natural law can only come from the author of natural law itself. And the Egyptians realized that. When the Jews left Egypt, every nation of the world was terrified of them. Who would start up with the Jews? Who would start up when the Jews had such a big brother? You see, if you have your brother, and your brother's the biggest one on the block, who's going to start up with his brother? And that's just a human being. Who's going to start up with a nation that has such close access to God, to such supernatural power, and has such, is so close to God that God will overturn all reality to defend them? Not anyone who wants to live, that's for sure. Not anyone who wants to value his life. And what happened? The Jews left Egypt. They went out, they received Torah and so on, and they started going through the desert, and lo and behold, Amalek, the nation of Amalek, these people who were very great in witchcraft also, extremely great in witchcraft, got together and said, look what happened, look what's going on over there. All these nations are terrified. You see this? Every Gentile nation is terrified of the Jews. Why? Why? Because they have God on their side? So what? So what? We cannot allow the situation to exist. We cannot allow God to intimidate any nation. And surely we cannot be intimidated by God. So another Amalekite guy says, well, wait a minute. What do you want to get us killed? I mean, if we go against these Jews now, who knows what they'll do? They'll call on this power of this God again and destroy us. So the Amalekites decided it is better to die at war with God than to live and allow this condition to remain. That is the arrogance of Amalek. It is the height of arrogance. It is the greatest kind of arrogance that you can see. Why? Because what it is, the person says, I will give up my life. I will be moister nefesh. I will be moister my nefesh. I will give up my life. I will pay the price of my life to war against God. Because I will not let Him tell me what to do. I will not be intimidated by Him in any sense. And it is better that I die than I live in this servitude. To quote Milton, it is better to what? To reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And that's the essence of Amalek. So what did Amalek do? Amalek ran out and they attacked the Jews. And of course, they lost. They lost. Essentially. They did lose. But that was what they knew. Why did Amalek go out and attack the Jews? What power did Amalek have to go out and attack the Jews? Well, what it says there is that the Jews, after Sinai, the Jews became weak a little bit and they became somewhat slack in their study of the Torah. When they became somewhat slack in the study of the Torah, some of this Kedusha went into Amalek. The Bittul Torah, or the lack of studying Torah, is the kind of Kedusha that goes to Amalek. You see. But just because the Kedusha goes to Amalek, Amalek therefore thought and said, we will defy the Jews, we will strike them, we will kill them, even if we have to die ourselves. And Amalek lost. But it was the accusation against the Jews that they were slack, they were not observant in their study of the Torah, that initially gave the power to Amalek. But Amalek had that power because Amalek was the most arrogant nation on earth. So they attacked the Jews. Once they attacked the Jews, and they lost. But they weren't all killed. They were essentially weakened. And the weak ones will survive. What happened? What happened? Well, the Torah says what happened. And I'll read it. It's in Beshalach. It's at the end of well, after the Jews had left Egypt, and at the end, after the Red Sea, we see here the story about what happens when they meet Amalek. Vayoma Hashem to Moshe, and God said to Moshe, this was after Amalek was vanquished. Write this as a remembrance in the book, the symbol of the Yeshua, and tell this to Yeshua. Ki why? This is God speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu. Ki mochoi emche ezech Amalek mitachat shemayim. I will totally obliterate the name of Amalek from under the heavens. I will totally annihilate them. Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach Vayiko Shema Hashem Nisi, and Moshe built the Mizbeach and he gave it a certain name. And he said Vayomer, and he said the following: Ki yod al kes yo Melchoma Lashem Amalek midor dor. What did Moshe say? He said Ki yod al kes yo, because their hand, the hand of Amalek, was on the throne of God. You see, therefore Melchoma Lashem Amalek, Amalek has declared war with God. Midor dor, in every generation. That's what it says. Strange, isn't it? It's a very strange prophet. But what is that prophet? Amalek has declared war on God. You see. Therefore, God will war against them in every generation. Now, if you look on the word kiyad, al kes yor, it says because their hand kiyad, the hand of Amalek, al kes yor, it is on that throne of God. Now, the word throne is really should be written like this: kisei. Kisei means a chair or a throne. But the way it's spelled in the Torah is that the aleph is missing. Kisei is missing. The aleph is missing. Why is the aleph missing? Because it says Amalek has put his hand on the throne of God. What is the throne of God in essence? The throne of God is the revelation of His power. Aleph, one, the revelation of the unity. And Amalek attempts to wipe out that Aleph. You see. And because of that, because they have wiped out, and they had wiped out the Aleph, they did. Why? Because when Amalek said, we don't care what God did, we will fight against them. In certain ways, they allowed all the other Gentile nations to suddenly say, if Amalek can do it, we can do it. Which means that they destroyed the incredible reputation and the power, the trembling that the Jews produced in all the nations. They were the first ones to attack the Jews, so that invincible image that the Jews had was gone. It's the same thing after the 6-Day War. The Jews had an incredible invincible image, but in the 73 war, in 1970, in the Yom Kippur War, that reputation was moved. The invincibility of the Jews as the people who can't lose a war was removed. So the Arabs had the chutzpah to start again. You see, the same thing. The invincibility of the Jews was removed. And what is the invincibility of the Jews? The invincibility of the Jews is in essence the invincibility of God. That's what it is, because God fought the war of the Jews. Amalek took away the Aleph. And what the Bunishim says is that Amalek will become the nation from now on who will serve as the ultimate vessel. How? Because the Bunishim did something to Amalek that he never did before and he never did again. Because Amalek went against God himself in the invincible stage. Since Amalek defied God in his most revealed form, in all the miracles that he showed, and still defied God, what the Bunishim said was, I will take away all the Kedusha that Amalek has. So Amalek lost every drop of Kedusha, every drop, and gave it up to the Satan. And what happened? Amalek shrank to zero. Now what does it mean when a person shrinks to zero? What does it mean when a person suddenly, his neshama has no Kedusha at all, has zero Kedusha? What does that mean? What it means is that neshama has no more yetzer. It means that that person can no longer think an idea which is good. He can't have the slightest iota of a good idea, of a kindness, or of a mercy, or of a compassion. That's what it means. He's lost his yetzer. He's lost any credibility, any possibility of the essence of being human, you see. But the question is, how does that person survive then? If this person no longer has a yetzer, then what is he? What is he? The answer is, he is the personification of the Sultan himself in human form. He is an angel of God in human form. He is one of the wicked angels of God, but he's a human being. And therefore he looks human. The Sultan, when he punishes the world and he punishes Israel through the power that he attained through sins, has a whole force of malachim or angels. And these are forces and powers that come down and do the damage that they do. When you go outside and something happens to you, something bad, what happens? How? Because there are malachim that come from the Sultan that do this. And they have the capacity to do this. They're called malachei chavola, or the angels of damage or destruction. They are the messengers of this force. You see. Amalek is a messenger, it's a satanic messenger in human form. He will think exactly like Satan. Exactly. He will have not a shred of hate at all. How does he survive? Only one way. If he has no Kedusha, how does he survive? He survives on the Kedusha of the Jews. He's a total parasite. Every Goyish nation unto itself can survive on itself because it has its own Kedusha. Because there are many Goyim who are good, you see. Or every Goy is good to some extent, has some good deeds, but Amalek has no good deeds. Amalek has no Kedusha at all. Therefore, Amalek is the absolute vessel of the Jews. He is the vessel that has Kedusha. But the Kedusha that he has is not his own. Because his own Kedusha is completely confiscated. But Amalek does have Kedusha. Why? Because who's Amalek's grandfather? Esau. Amalek has the Kedusha of Esau. But surrounded with the Kedusha of Esau is a nucleus of total tumah. He doesn't have a shred of Kedusha, a holiness by himself. We see. Therefore, Amalek is the perfect vessel for the Jews at their worst stage. You see. Because Amalek has the Kedusha to hold the Kedusha of the Jews because of what he inherited from Esau, and he has the greatest degree of tumah because he himself is pure tumah. So therefore, he is the insurance. He is the insurance of the Jews, Amalek. That's why God says, you must destroy him. You must destroy every Amalekite, man, woman, and child. Why? Because Amalek is not a person. That's why. It sounds strange. The guy looks like a human being, but that's it. The reason why the punishment says you must destroy him, because the punishment says this is a satanic messenger. This is not a person, you see. That's number one. The second thing is that when God said the following, since they, Amalek, has robbed my Allah, they have robbed my unity, they have robbed my invincibility, they will become the vessel which will always take your Kedusha. They are your natural enemy, you see. An Amalekite is a genius in spirituality. Because since an Amalekite is pure evil, an Amalekite is the one Gentile who knows what true holiness is. And he hates it with all his being. Amalek knows what a Jew is better than any other Goy alive. Amalek knows what a Jew is, and he knows what Torah is. Amalek knows who God is better than anyone else alive. There was no one else in the world besides the highest Jews who had as clear an understanding of who God is than an Amalekite. Strange, isn't it? But it's exactly that understanding that motivates him to want a war with God. It's exactly the opposite to a tzaddik. But his perception is brilliant. He is a spiritual magnet to the Jews. He looks at a Jew and he sees what the Kedusha of a Jew is. And his entire being is filled with contempt and with a desire to destroy them. Who is the Amalek in history? Haman. Haman was an Amalekite. And Haman could not stand it because Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him. Even though Haman was the prime minister of Persia, he couldn't stand it because the Jew Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him. And his arrogance was so great that he said, why doesn't Mordechai bow down to me? Because he's Jewish. It is the essence of Judaism, you see, to hold God as a supreme being and never bow down to a person or to another thing. And that's what I hate. I hate the submission to God, because I must be the God. You see, it is the war between equal adversaries. And Amalek is able to look at the majesty of God and say, I want it. I want it. And I refuse to live with that majesty or that power in the hands of any other being, even if it means my life. That's the incredible dedication of an Amalekite, you see. And the point is that Amalek has robbed Yahweh. That level of arrogance has robbed God's invisibility, because he doesn't have a shred of the fear of God. He becomes the absolute vessel. Here's the amazing thing. And here's what you see, God's true power. Remember we said a long time ago that God has what's called Yichud Shvitato, the absolute unity of his power? Yichud Shvitato, the unity of God's power. There is nothing greater than God's power at all. You cannot frustrate God's will, even if you want. What did Amalek do? Amalek said, we will defy God. We will defy God and we will destroy the Jews. We will destroy every vestige of what? Of God's presence in the world. Even if it means the cost of our life. So the Holiness says, try it. But none of that. What God says is the following. That you think that you can what? You can war against me and you can remove me? Then I want you to know the following. In your effort and in your desire to remove me from the world, that will bring the redemption of the world. Your very war against me is the way you will save the world. Because that's what happened. Amalek rebelled against God and tried to remove God's presence in the world. Tried to destroy the Jews. And the Holiness says, fine, I will use you as the ultimate safety valve of the Jews. Because you have descended to such a low level, because you have descended to such a worst level of arrogance, you will become their safety valve. So your arrogance will be my instrument. You think that your arrogance can be used against me. You think that you can war with me. But that arrogance itself will become my instrument, because it will allow you to become the last vessel of the Jews, to save them, so they're not destroyed. So your arrogance will be my tool. You see, you don't realize it, but in your fight against me, you will be serving my purpose. That's the Hanok Yichud working. Because even when we attempt to defy God, the very act of the defiance itself is the establishment of his will. You see, it's not that God says, well, you won't succeed and I'm still with you, I'll destroy you. God doesn't say that. God says, do whatever you want. Try it. And your very act, your very effort, will be the way that my will will ultimately established. You will be my instrument. You will be my messenger. The more you fight against me, the more you will establish my cause. The more you attempt to annihilate my presence, my Torah, the more you will demonstrate my true control of reality. You see, that's why Amalek is the greatest example of God's incredible power, the power to use his enemies as his allies. What are we saying? We're saying that Amalek will become the vessel to the Jews. When the Jews sin to terrible levels, their Kedusha will go in the hands of Amalek, and then Amalek will have the ability, you see, to persecute the Jews and give them that Kedusha back. That is the purpose of Amalek. And then you can ask a very good question. Wait a minute. If Amalek is our safety valve, if he's our insurance policy, then why does God tell us that we have to destroy every Amalekites? It's like God says, rip up your insurance policy. That's suicide. If we need Amalek as the nation, as the vessel, to give us back our Kedusha no matter how deeply we descend, then how does God tell us to destroy an Amalekite? Man, woman, and child. Do you see the question? The answer is that this mitzvah is a loaded mitzvah. It is a very different mitzvah than all other mitzvahs. All of the mitzvahs, God says to you, do this mitzvah. And you try and do it, and you will establish a certain success. All of the mitzvahs are somewhat different. In all of the mitzvahs, you try and do the mitzvah. If you perform the mitzvah, fine. But over here, there's a very important thing. The ability to destroy Amalek is the last mitzvah. It is the last mitzvah in the Torah. Not in the written Torah, but it's the last mitzvah that we will perform as Jews before the Messiah arrives. Why? For the simple reason that Amalek remains the final repository of the Kedusha of the Jews. And if we are evil, if we Jews transgress the Torah, then we will give over our Kedusha to Amalek. If our Amalek has our Kedusha, we will not be able to annihilate him. We will not be able to perform the mitzvah. Because Amalek has our power. But if we will keep the Torah and we will observe it fully, then what happens is Amalek will no longer have our Kedusha. And therefore we will be able to annihilate Amalek. So in other words, it depends on us. We are the ones who have to restore that Aleph. We must restore the Aleph. It lies in us. What God says, Amalek took the Aleph away. You see, it is your job to put it back. If you put back that Aleph, you will destroy Amalek. I will allow you to perform the mitzvah fully. You see, but if you don't restore that Aleph, then Amalek will have the Aleph, and you will not be able to do anything. You see. That's really what it is. In other words, when we see the most important thing, that in this world, there are two adversaries which are locked in an eternal battle. The Jew and Amalek. Amalek is a natural enemy of the Jew, and the Jew is a natural enemy of Amalek. They are mutually exclusive because both cannot survive in the same world. It is impossible. Only one can survive and not the other. Only one can have that Aleph and not the other. Aleph is the survival. Aleph is the survival. If Amalek has the Aleph, they survive and we begin to die. You see, if we have the Aleph, then Amalek dies. That's what it is. Amalek is the vestibule of that holds the power of God. We have to choose where we want that power of God to be. So therefore, the mitzvah of destroying an Amalekite is not only a mitzvah that we have to do, in a sense, it's a barometer, because it tells us, to the degree that God allows us to destroy Amalek, to that degree, that means we are ready for the Messianic period. You see, Amalek is the final barometer of the success of the Jews, because Amalek holds the last power. You see, it's in the hands of Amalek. Whether or not we will be able to fulfill the mitzvah of destroying Amalek depends on whether or not we are good Jews. That's really what it is. In other words, if we do the mitzvahs, we will be able to destroy Amalek. And we won't need Amalek anymore as an insurance policy. Why? Because we took back the Kedusha ourselves. We will have what? We will have vacated Amalek as a vessel. If we are all observe Torah, if we adhere to God, if we develop a relationship with the punishment, we listen to His will. So what happens is He doesn't need Amalek anymore as a vessel. Because we don't need vessels, we don't need retrieval. We will have acquired our Kedusha. So Amalek therefore will be destroyed. We will have the ability to identify and destroy an Amalek. But if we are not good Jews, you see, if we are selfish, narcissistic, if we only think of ourselves, we refuse to develop a relationship with God, we refuse to devote ourselves to Kedusha, then what will happen is that Amalek will be necessary as an instrument to save us, to give us back our Kedusha whether we want it or not. So Amalek therefore will become the vessel. And if Amalek is therefore needed as the vessel, we will not be able to make the mitzvah of destroying Amalek. Do you see how it goes? Interesting, isn't it? So the mitzvah of destroying Amalek is a very strange one. It is at the heart and it's the essence of what it means to be Jewish. It is a battle for the Aleph. And that Aleph is the throne of God. God's throne only has two letters. You see, the Aleph of that throne is missing. We battle Amalek every generation for that Aleph. If we are successful, we restore the Aleph and the throne is complete. Kisei is complete. If we don't, Amalek holds the Aleph and the throne is incomplete. He therefore becomes a vessel nation to persecute us. What is the structure of an Amalek? We now understand critical principles about the Hashgacha. This is so important what I said, because it shows you who the true adversary is. Now wait. Let's look at an Amaleki. Can we identify an Amaleki? Can we do it? Not easy. Because in order to identify an Amaleki, you can't just walk over and say, hey, you look like an Amaleki, and pull out a knife or a gun. That's ridiculous. Besides the fact that you'll be arrested and thrown in jail. You know, it's not that simple, you see. We cannot identify an Amaleki. We can't. No one knows who Amalek is anymore. Because Amalek has been interspersed with all the nations of the world, you see. But we can know something about generally where Amalek resides, which nations of the world seem to have that power vested in them. How? We know about the virtue of what I told you before. Let's analyze it. Remember I said that what? Amalek now is the vessel nation? That is the main nation? Right? What is the structure of Amalek? Well, obviously that's the nation that's going to have the Kedusha of the Jews, isn't it? Remember what we said about the Kedusha of the Jews? What does Kedusha of the Jews mean? If the Jews had their own Kedusha, it means they would have an incredible wisdom called Ferris. They would understand the Torah in its inner light. They would be able to see through the meaning of history. And they would have Oz. Oz means prosperity and power and strength. If the Jews had their Kedusha, they would be the wisest and most powerful nation on earth to an extraordinary degree. When they lose the Kedusha, their wisdom and their strength go over to the Goyim. That's what Kedusha means. It means wisdom and it means strength or power, prosperity. You see. Obviously, an Amalek would have to be a nation which is extraordinary in wisdom and strength, wouldn't it? Obviously, since they have the Kedusha of the Jews in such a powerful level. When we look around and we attempt to find, we've got to find a nation which subscribes to that. That's number one. That nation has to be extraordinarily, today, in science and technology. It has to be a nation which is always at the pinnacle of chachma, of wisdom, of culture, of art, and of technology. We've got to find that nation. That nation has the soul of Amalek. That's number one. Number two, but when do the Jews interact with Amalek? Fine. We know that Amalek is the vessel nation. We know now that it's the absolute vessel nation. But when do we interface with Amalek? When? We know also, when do we get interface with Amalek? Obviously when the Jews get down to the bottom. Right? By definition. You know, we may interface with Amalek throughout history. You see, we will. But when do we really hit Amalek? When do suddenly the Jews and Amalek clash head-on in the most extraordinary battle of all time? At the end, when the Jews have reached the lowest level. But when do Jews reach the lowest level? When? At the end of time, you see. At the end of time. That's when they reach the lowest level. What do you mean the end of time? If the Jews fail to bring the Mashiach by virtue of their deeds, they will bring the Mashiach by virtue of this retrieval. Either the Jews acquire the Kedusha through their own mitzvahs and their own free will and bring the Mashiach, or they will bring the Mashiach by how? By descending into a nation and retrieving it. But if the Jews go on, year after year, and don't do it, there will come a time when they're coming to the end, when the Mashiach must arrive, which means that the Jews have reached the bottom of the barrel. At that point, they will have to descend into Amalek and pull back that Kedusha. In other words, the Jews will only descend into Amalek at the end of time, right before the Messianic period. Do we understand this? Now the question is, what nation fills that prescription, really? What nation fills the prescription of incredible cruelty and incredible evil? But then, what nation wants to kill a Jew because he's Jewish? For no other reason. What nation knows that the only reason why it survives is to destroy the Jew? Not to get his money, to get anything, it's to annihilate Jews. Which nation lives to kill Jews? Which nation lives to kill Jews and at the same time is the greatest vessel or the greatest container for wisdom and for science and technology? What? In essence, Germany. Who among the greatest philosophers? You want to see, if you ever take a look at the list of German achievements, it is staggering. Germany outshines every nation. Philosophy, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Hegel, Nietzsche, Hegel, Marx. If you look at the greatest philosophers, you will find them in Germany. You will find the greatest scientists in Germany. I mean, the German science was always known as the greatest science of all. You will find the greatest musicians of Germany. Bach, Beethoven. You will find all the greatest musicians in Germany. Brahms, they're all Germans. The essence of all music that we have, most of it is German really. Most of the music that we have, classical music, the great music, the music of subtlety is German. Why? Because Germany has the highest light of the Jews. We must remember an incredible thing about Amalek. Amalek lives on the Kedusha of Jews. It doesn't have Kedusha itself. It doesn't have it at all. Because Amalek has given up its Kedusha. All Amalek has is the Kedusha of the Jews. It's inflated with the Kedusha of the Jews. Which means an incredible thing. Amalek is an incredible contradiction. It is the most evil nation on earth. But it is also the most sublime nation on earth at the same time. By definition. Which is astounding. How can a nation which is so evil and so cruel be so sublime in its concept, in its art, and its sciences? It's an absolute contradiction. Normally when a person acts like an animal, he thinks like an animal. But how can a person act like a total animal and think like an Einstein? Create music like a Brahms or Beethoven? How is that possible? That's what an Amalek is. That is the peculiarity of an Amalek. It's not a contradiction. Yes, it is a contradiction under normal circumstances, but not when you understand what this pattern is about. There's no contradiction. An Amalek is perfect. An Amalek will come over to you and say, "You're a Jew," pull out a gun and shoot you in the head, and then sit down and then cry at Beethoven. Or Brahms, or Wagner. You see, he'll sit down and he'll literally come over with a knife and slice your head off. And then he'll sit down and read the poems of Goethe and Schiller, and he'll literally cry at that. How is that possible? That's an Amalek. No other human being is capable of this. All of the humans, if they are animals, they think like animals. And if they are great people, they think like great people. But only Amalek has the unusual combination of both extremes. Because he is both extremes. He is the bottom pit of Esau, and he is the highest level of the Jews. Who fits that description? Germany, you see. Here's where we see an instant thing. The Holocaust. The Holocaust. 6 million Jews died at the hands of the Nazis. 6 million Jews died at the hands of the Nazis. They died at the hands of a nation who was considered the greatest nation on earth at the time. By World War I and World War II, every nation in the world knew that Germany is the most sublime nation on earth when it comes to science, technology, and philosophy. There was no one to match the Germans. That's why no one can believe what the Germans could do at all. The Germans then went ahead and they killed the Jews. They killed the Jews. And it's a very interesting thing. The German Jews were very different than the other Jews, the Polish Jews in Europe, other Jews, Eastern European Jews. Because the German Jews were the most assimilated of all. Reformed, conservative, all these movements started in Germany. The Reformed, conservative, all these movements that took the Jews away from Judaism, that attempt to what? To say that God did not give the Torah on Sinai. It all started with the Jews. The German Jews were the only Jews that said, we are proud to be Germans first and Jews second. The German Jews looked down on all of the Jews with total contempt in Eastern Europe. They looked down to the Polish Jews and the Russian Jews contemptuously. People with payas and so on, that they didn't want anything to do with. You see, it was the German Jews who were the most arrogant and so on. And it was the German Jews who were the first ones to die. Because the disease started in Amalek. The disease started in Germany. You see. And that's what it was. Germany first attempted to seduce the Jews with its Weltanschauung, with its culture, its higher culture. And it succeeded admirably. Phase 2. An enormous power went to Amalek. Amalek now had the power to persecute. The power to persecute. But the power to destroy. You see. But the power to destroy in such a way that has never been seen. Never been seen before. What do we see from this? This is the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the final match between the Jews and Amalek. But that final match cannot occur until the end of time. The Holocaust is the greatest sign that the Messiah is almost here. Because the Jews will not confront an Amalek until the Mashiach is about to rise, right before. Do we see? Because Amalek will only be used as the absolute total vessel. Amalek will only be allowed to reign supreme in the way that he did. Only if the Jews had descended to the bottom, you see. When they had to retrieve the levels, the Kedusha, from the deepest levels of Tumah. That's the only time when God will allow Amalek to become the absolute vessel that it is in such a total way. Even though the Jews would interface with Amalek throughout history, it would only be in specific forms, but never in such a way. Never. Only when the thing was necessary. This is the Holocaust. The Holocaust, in essence, is an act of retrieval, but it is an incredible final act of retrieval. It is the most profound and the most important act of retrieval right before the coming of the Mashiach. Germany. There are many ways that we know that Germany is an Amalek. There's a very, very interesting article that I once read, and I would like to read, and we'll end it off here, about a conversation that Hitler had with Goebbels, you see. And I'd like to read this very briefly, just what it is, and you'll see specifically what the genius of an Amalek is. An incredible genius. In his conversations with Hitler, a book first published at the beginning of the war, Hermann Roschning, the former Nazi Galota, I don't know what that means, of Danzig, tells of an unusual discussion with Hitler that took place only a couple of years after his rise to power. This is a discussion that he overheard about Hitler. It was a conversation with Nazism revealed itself for the first time as an attempt at an anti-spiritual revolution, which to Hitler was the same as anti-Jewish revolution on a global scale. This was the discussion. Suddenly I heard Hitler scream in his well-known manner. He was standing in front of a desk. Rauschning is recording what he heard. And he's saying the following. He's relating this conversation that he heard from Hitler. This is extremely telling. Suddenly I heard Hitler scream in his well-known manner. He was standing in front of his desk, leafing through a scrapbook with newspaper clippings about him from the time of the struggle for power. No, Hitler yelled at Goebbels and Streicher, who was standing before him. I'm not interested. Whether German Christians or Roman Catholics or God knows what kind of Protestant sneaks, I'm not interested. Apparently, there was a discussion at that point whether or not the German forces with the German Christians. They were thinking of joining, you see, the German Christians at that time to attempt to yield power. You see, Hitler said, I'm not interested whether German Christians or Roman Catholics or God knows what kind of Protestant sneaks, I'm not interested. Give them an inch and they'll take a yard. Goebbels agreed. Goebbels is mouthing again what Hitler saying. The enthusiasm of those German Christians for our movement, apparently the German Christians were very enthusiastic about the Nazis. So Hitler was saying, Goebbels was saying, the enthusiasm of those German Christians for our movement is as big a lie as anything that has come from Protestant quarters. By misusing us for their miserable away from our movement, they consider themselves particularly smart. Hitler recognized that the German Christians who were Protestants wanted to join with the Nazis so they can establish themselves away from Rome. You see. And they were thinking at that time whether or not they should allow this. They should join the Nazis and German Christians. So he was saying no. But don't you think we ought to support the German religious movement of Professor Hoher and others? Streicher asked. All this is cramped, Hitler replied contemptuously. It is false and deceitful and without strength. And Chamberlain's book, Words of Jesus, couldn't one cut the German churches loose from their connection with the Jewish Old Testament in the same manner? Inquired Wagner, Goletta from Munich. I read what was happening was he was saying there that there was a certain part of the German Christian movement that was trying to say that the German Christians have nothing to do with the Old Testament. So he's saying, well, what about those German Christians? They don't want to have to do with the Old Testament. Why don't we join up with them? Houston Stewart Chamberlain had the right attitude towards many of our most urgent problems, Hitler answered. But what he has been trying to do with this, what has he been trying to do with this non-Jewish Christianity idea is completely nonsensical. This guy Chamberlain was trying to say that Christianity has nothing to do with Judaism, you see. Marcion already tried to separate, another author, Christianity from Judaism. Goebbels interjected. It never worked. It couldn't possibly work. It's not possible to separate Judaism from Christianity. And because of that, we can't have anything to do with the German Christians. Historically speaking, the Christian religion is nothing but a Jewish sect. It has always been and always will remain just that, as long as it will exist. Hitler went on. Hitler was a genius. Hitler thought that there's no such thing as a Christian. Christians are Jews in soul, really. It's the same thing. Even though they hide under the name Christian. We don't fight only the Christian circles, we fight against Christian ideas. They constitute the real poison in our blood, Streicher said. Because Hitler understood and the Nazis understood, it's not the Christians, it is their ideas which are the poison. That's right. After the destruction of Judaism, the extinction of Christian slave morals must follow logically. Hitler began to pace up and down the room. Hitler knew that the next enemy was the Christians after the Jews. I shall know the moment when to confront for the sake of the German people in the world their Asiatic slave morals with our picture of the free man the godlike man. This is what Hitler thought. The free man, the godlike man, is the man who is against all form of religion. There is much more behind this. Hitler began frantically. It is not merely a question of Christianity and Judaism. We are fighting against the most ancient curse that humanity has brought upon itself. We are fighting against the perversion of our soundest instincts. The God of the desert, that crazed, stupid, vengeful, Asiatic despot with his power to make laws. That slave keeper's whip, the devilish thou shalt, and the stupid thou shalt not. It's got to get out of our blood. That curse from Mount Sinai. That poison with which both Jews and Christians have spoiled and soiled the free, wonderful instincts of man and lowered them to their levels of dog-like fright. You see what Hitler saw? He understood what the Jew is. He understood what the Torah is. The Torah sets up laws, you see, which says to man, you must submit yourself to God's will because God is the ultimate force. And Hitler saying we cannot do that. Man is the God. We must free ourselves like this. And this is the Jewish soul, the Jewish contribution to history, and something that Christians just parrot. The time for false considerations has ended. This is true. We no longer need to be considered, Hitler went on. Whatever is against nature is against life itself. That's why nations die out. They kill themselves under the curse of thou shalt and the thou shalt not. Honor thy father and thy mother? No, Goebbels interrupted. Every boy will revolt and hate his father and must do so to start his own life. It is an immortal law of nature. This is the Nazis. This is their thinking. Thou shalt not steal. Wrong, Hitler's voice was loud in the small room. All life is theft. Yes. Thou shalt not desire thy neighbor's this and that. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not. What not? Goebbels laughed derisively. I am the Lord thy God. Who? That Asiatic tyrant? No, Hitler shouted. Now hear this. The day will come when I shall hold up against these commandments the tables of a new law. You have to look at the way Hitler talks. This is spiritual language Hitler is talking. This is not the language of an insane person. This is not the language of a person bereft of spirituality. This is a person whose neshama is so high that he sees the essence of what the light of the Jews is. See what he says. I am the Lord thy God. He says, that Asiatic tyrant? No, he says the following. The day shall come when I shall hold up against these commandments the tables of a new law. Hitler says, I will create a new covenant with mankind. Exactly what God says, but exactly in reverse. And history will recognize our movement as the great battle for humanity's liberation. A liberation from the curse of Mount Sinai, from the dark stammerings of nomads who no more could trust their own instincts, who could understand the divine only in the form of a tyrant who orders one to do the very things one doesn't like. This is what we are fighting against. The masochistic spirit of self-torment, the curse of so-called morals, idolized to protect the weak from the strong in the face of the immortal law of divine nature. Against the so-called Ten Commandments, against them we are fighting. Now I ask you, is this the insight of an animal? This is the insight of a person who has incredible spiritual insight from the other side. He understood exactly what the Jews were and who they were. And he knew that he must destroy the Jews at all costs because the Jews represent the greatest disease of mankind. The disease of Yiras Shamayim. The disease of the fear of heaven. That's what they represent, and he knew in his guts that he must destroy it. And what is well known is toward the end of the war, when Hitler was losing the war, and the trains were carrying the Jews to Auschwitz, the German generals were screaming at Hitler. They were saying, what are you doing? We're losing the war. Why are you taking the trains that we need for munitions, and for food, and for weapons, and why are you using them to kill Jews? So Hitler said, what are you, stupid? We have no other purpose but to kill Jews. That's the essence of the whole war. Here you see an Amalekite to its bottom line. Because what is an Amalekite? An Amalekite says, I'd rather die and war with God than live under his submission. He's just saying, so what, we're losing the war? So what? As long as we kill Jews, as long as we dump the last of them, it doesn't mean a difference. This is our essence. This line, you see, this statement is Amalekite in its most natural core. Because Amalekite is a natural adversary of the Jew. Just like the Jew has the Kedusha, which says that the essential idea is Yiras Shamayim, the fear of heaven, that there is a God, that there is one God who essentially has the right
to tell men what to do so that we can become close to him? He says, I recognize this as the greatest disease of mankind. And I must devote my existence to annihilate this disease and destroy this desperate desert God of the Jews, to destroy the Ten Commandments, to destroy the idea that man is subservient to a higher will. Do I need further proof that Germany is, and Nazism is Amalek? Or doesn't this say this all?